Teste, teste, teste. Bom dia, bom dia, bom dia, bom dia, bom dia a todos. Good morning to all ladies and gentlemen that are here. We welcome everybody to the talk of Dr. Kerstin Haring. Dr. Haring is an assistant professor of computer science at the University of Denver. She directs the Human Robot Technology Laboratory that envisions interdisciplinary research in robotics with the goal of improving human lives through the promotion of better technology. Before her appointment at the University of Denver, she researched human-machine teaming at the US Air Force Academy, completed her PhD in human-robot interaction at the University of Tokyo in Japan, and studied computer science at the University of Freiburg in Germany. She will talk today about design human robotics, trust, ethics, and human expectations. We welcome Dr. Haring. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I appreciate having the opportunity to speak today at the first Brazilian conference on robotics, on how robots increasingly take on more social roles and how robot user experience is becoming more important. And I want to share some of my research on the intersection of human-robot interaction, trust, robot ethics, and the human expectation towards robots. And I'm really thankful that I had the privilege of working and researching robotics across Germany, Japan, Australia, and now in Denver in the United States. So it has given me this incredible opportunities to see robots, the people who design robots, and the people who interact with robots through many different lenses. And these experiences are the foundations of the idea of humane robotics, where robots are benevolent, right? They mean well, and where the humane stands for the discipline of robotics, where we are refining robots and where we're creating robot technology that empowers people. So there's an entire community, right? There's researchers, designers, engineers, they're dedicated to the goal of making robots interact with humans. And when we consider human-robot interaction, the first thing that often comes to mind are robots from science fiction. And these robots are so prevalent that research actually frequently looks into them and considers it as the first robot exposure people have. So, and they also serve as an interaction for our future interactions with robots. This could be really friendly robots like R2-D2, not so friendly robots like the Terminator, This is like more of my favorite robots, right? Baymax, who is very empathetic and also really squishy. There's a texture to this robot that I really like. New robots like Ross from the Wild Robot. And my personal favorite, Wall-E, right? Who's not only really expressive, very empathetic, but also saves planet Earth. So these are really well-designed robots, but they're science fiction. We're not that far behind, though, right? Because we are building robots to interact with people in schools, hospitals, our workplace, airports, and in our homes. And here's the one thing I keep reminding myself of, is that robots are not humans. And we still don't fully understand what happens or what are the consequences of us interacting with robots. And how do we design robot behaviors to interact with us? And yet, we're developing robots to do exactly that. And in the novel, like A Brave New World, right, like Aldous Huxley warns us about what happens when we design or when we push technological advancements without ethics. And like robots are these amazing technological advancements, and they have incredible opportunities to improve our lives. But we also carry some risk when we're designing these robots, when we design them without empathy and we design them without responsibility on what impact they're having. So robot design is important. And engineers, right, they make robots work. They're solving the hard problems. Or as we heard yesterday in the plenary talk, right, they solve the easy problems, like whichever ones are harder. And then people ask why, like why did you build this robot? Why can't it fold my laundry? And it's really hard for machines to explain what they cannot do. And it's really hard for humans to understand like why they cannot do this, right? Especially when they look like they could or when they behave like they could do these things. So we're coming in with these expectations, and then we're kind of disappointed and there's a mismatch when the robot's capabilities don't match those expectations. So these poor robots, they're thrown into our messy, emotional, and unpredictable world. And through my journey in interdisciplinary robotics, right, I explored the space of like how robot appearance shapes human expectations, how robots gain or lose trust, and how people react when robots do unexpected things. So these are not just quirks of interaction, those are fundamental human reactions. And I want robots to work with people. So it's my job to understand and design and adapt robot technology for those reactions. And my approach is to consider robot design choices. So human expectations are, we like certainty. We make plans, we appreciate a conference schedule, we like to have guarantees of what happens next. And when we can predict what happens next, we are pretty happy. So certainty. Right? So that sounds easy enough. We design robots that are very reliable and very predictable. But here's the thing. Like, predictable robots are boring. So I ran several studies, and people played with these robots, and they were just bored. The robot was acting exactly as it should. And people got bored in that interaction. So here's the idea of like, let's introduce some uncertainty and some excitement and some complexity in our robot interactions. But then, right, having people engage with these uncertain robots requires navigating the human experience really carefully. So I'm going to take you back to the 2000s. I'm going to date myself a little bit here. Long before ChatGPT and even Alexa, there was a sassy little chatbot, and it was called Smarter Child. Smarter Child lived inside an AOL Messenger, and it had a personality. And I apologize, early 2000s, right? These are the old interfaces. Smarter Child would have interactions with the user, and it would tell it off. It would say like, okay, enough with this nonsense. Or it would ask people like, hey, what's so funny? And when the users would insult Smarter Child, it would actually push back and say like, wow, I don't want you to talk that way. I don't like the way you're speaking now. Those are awful words to use. Just imagine ChatGPT just talking back to you and say like, no, we're not having this conversation this way. It would actually go so far, it would stop responding to users until they apologized for their behaviors. And it also, like, right, would have unexpected reactions, right? It would, when users asked, like, would you sleep? It would say, like, no, but I dream. I dream of a better world, a world where man and machine can coexist in peace and happiness. So distance isn't smart in the way we think of AI today, right? But it's engaging, and it's unpredictable in a really delightful way. And I'm going to show you how this inspired some robotics research. So let's start with robots that move, right? Movement is a really strong indicator of, like, intentions. And this is an old study. So it's an all-time favorite of mine in, like, psychology. And these are just a few shapes. You see two triangles and a circle, and they're moving around. So something happens when you're watching this. So when researchers showed this video to people, they didn't say, oh, there's shapes moving around. They didn't use those words. They started saying things like, oh, wow, this big triangle is angry. It's a bully. They said, like, oh, the small triangle is, like, trying to protect the circle. So they saw a narrative, right? They saw intention, they saw emotion, they saw agency, just in moving shapes. And we have this social meaning of things that move, right? So now imagine when things that move suddenly have a face, or arms, or, like, eyes. So that is something very, very powerful. And robots don't even need to have a face. Humans can see faces where there are no faces, right? We see them here in appliances. We see them in sinks. I'm from Colorado. It snowed last week. We're done with winter, right? So I'm with the angry barbecue here. We see faces everywhere, in coffee, in houses. And we not only see faces, we see moods. We see a personality. And these objects have no intention at all. So, and this has huge implications for robots, right? When all this comes together with movement, right, we see personalities in inanimate objects. We see intention in that motion. It shouldn't be really surprising when we ask kids to design robots, like how they turn out. So in my studies, right, I asked children to imagine robots, and imagine robots with abilities that adults don't really come up with, right? It makes no sense to ask, like, please design us a robot that can feel love. Or please design a robot that can feel hunger. And no matter what these robots were supposed to do, the children all put faces on those robots. And you can see the robots with love. They have this soft texture, right, the little pink squishy things on them. I really like that the robot that can feel hunger has this very big mouth, right? That's where the hunger goes in. And your brain is doing this work of, like, giving robots this personality already before we even start interacting with them. And right, we're talking now with faces, and, like, one of the strongest facial expressions are smiles. Smiles are really powerful. Smiles are so powerful that even, like, people who are congenitally blind, right, will learn how to smile. They just smile, right, even if they've never seen a person smile. And then it hit, after years of researching me, it actually hit me, because the very first robot I've ever met was a robot at the University of Freiburg by Wolfram Burkhardt. Like, one of the world's leading minds in, like, robot navigation, right? And that robot was doing Monte Carlo localization. I didn't understand it at the time, right? Not sure if I understand it. It was a really cool robot. It was doing localization really well. It looked like a huge, large box. But guess what? It had this face, right? And it smiled. This is the very first robot I ever encountered. In fact, we really didn't have a lot of robots around. So in conclusion, right, roboticists are just children with fancier toys. But what these robots design reveal, right, about humans is we have this need to make sense and to understand robots. So our cognitive processes leave us no choice but to like see motion, like to recognize like intentions and faces in machines, and we respond socially to these embodied machines. But most robots today are not quite ready for these social responses. They're too slow. You might have encountered robots, there's a little delay when you interact with them. They're too clunky, they're a little bit off. They don't really get humans. And these robots are all robots that were designed in Japan, right? And I ran studies with them and I measured people's expectations. And like robot appearance really shapes that expectation. So different robot design, different expectations. But then I had people interact with those robots. And for all of those robots, these expectations or this attitude changed the second people started interacting with those robots. And this is still realistic because a lot of people don't see robots in their daily lives. So we form these expectations, and then we start interacting with robots, and actually things change in those very first interactions. So people have expectations towards robots that are not accurate. So keep that in mind, right, when you're bringing together people and robots. If they've never seen robots before, if they have seen a different kind of robot before, in your study, things might change. So, and there's often a question about robots and cultural exposure, right? We say like, oh, wow, Japan comes to mind really quickly. People say, like, oh, Japan loves robots. So I ran studies on that, so that I compared like an Australian population and a Japanese population. And we used the Android robot in the bottom right. So this is not two women. This is one of those people is a robot. And I expected, right, that Japanese are like a lot more open to the robots. And the opposite was the case. Australians actually rated that robot much more highly than Japanese participants. So that was a little surprise. We had very similar results, though, for both countries in like how expectations and attitudes towards that robot changed once they interacted with it. Because they saw that robot first, and they're like, oh, wow, this is not a safe robot. It seems really intelligent. And then we had to interact with them, and then they came out, and they're like, oh, yeah, you know what, it's actually not that smart. But it was a lot safer when they came out of the study. So people were like a little bit disappointed, but they also were really relieved that this robot wasn't able of what they think it could do. So, and also like, right, as a side note, a lot of our HRI data, like when we have humans interact with robots, it comes from just a few places. So when people ask like, well, does culture really shape the experiences with robots? We cannot fully answer this question. Because a lot of places, right, like the sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, Latin America, we don't run these studies. So these areas are still vastly underrepresented in HRI. So right now we're missing out on really powerful and culturally rich insights that could help us to design better robots. And humans learn to trust robots, or very often we just initially trust them. So trust is this weird concept, and it's not really a metric, right? It is called foundational to robot interactions, but it's really hard to measure. So we use proxies to measure robot trust. It's just too simple to ask, like, would you trust a robot surgeon? And your answer would be like, well, it depends. And it depends on so many factors. So directly asking this question does not work. So we measure things around. We're trying to find good trust models, right? Like I played around with Swift trust, which is the kind of trust when people are thrown together in like teams, like flight crews, they never met each other. And people just assume like capabilities and trust by like roles and ranks. And I thought, oh wow, this would be amazing for robotics. But then we bring people and robots together and we find like, oh wow, they don't know what robots can do. So this was a nice exercise, but I'm gonna postpone this kind of research for the future. So then we say like, oh, robots need to be reliable. They need to be really transparent about their decisions and about their communication. This will increase trust. But then when my student, Ben, ran a study, and we had a robot to drive around and identify changes in an environment, push it back onto AR goggles, and then the robot made errors. So it would identify those changes. You see those blue spheres there, right, on the first image. It's like a correct identification of a change in the environment, and then it would make different kind of errors. Now the robot would say how confident it is in its like evaluation of the environment. And people mostly ignored that. They really were judging the robot based on what the robot was doing, and the effects of the robot making errors were just slightly mitigated by the robot saying I'm not so confident in this decision. But people were like, yeah, but you still made an error. So the trust dropped with that bad performance of the robot. Luckily, people are very forgiving when it comes to robots. They're actually more forgiving than when they interact with other machines and automation. So the robot acts good again and has good performance, trust comes back up. So users give it another chance really quickly. But that doesn't answer the question, should you trust robots? And I'm going to tell you, if you come to my lab and you're a participant, you probably shouldn't trust the robots. Because I ran some interesting studies. So we're going to take a little detour into ethics, because in the 1960s, there was a psychologist called Stanley Milgram, and he ran a study where an authority figure asked a participant to deliver electric shocks to another person. And they were told it was for science, and the other person learns that way. And even when the learner screamed or went silent, the person in the lab coat, the person with authority, told them, keep going. It is essential that you keep going. And people did. So nowadays, this is really unethical. And they ran a replication study from that, and it was titled with the headline, 9 out of 10 people would electrocute another person if asked. So any study today, right, has this ethical board oversight where we go and ask for permission to run these studies. And you can imagine the faces of my ethical board when I said the Milgram study, but with robots. So we had some very interesting discussions about on how we can run this. And I want to be very clear to make the distinction that we ran the study with compliance, right? So where people respond to a request from a robot. Where Milgram was looking into compliance, right? Where people are obedient to a command. So very different. So the study I ran, right, with these 3 robots, no distress, no deception, no pressure. But the question remains, right? Can robots influence people? And I wanted to test this with this 3 very different robots. One was literally a Roomba robot that we modified a little bit, and now a robot, and then a Baxter robot. And I had high hopes for the Baxter robot because it's so tall. It's 6 feet, 1.80 meters tall. It towers over me, right? It has these big muscles. It's huge. And I thought people will definitely listen to this robot. So what did we found? Right, so I ran 2 studies to explore this, right? The robots were coaching people. Participants were asked to perform really repetitive tasks. They were actually easy, simple, and a little bit boring, right? They were easy to quit too. People could just say anytime, okay, I'm done. They were actually, in fact, they were so boring that at least 3 participants fell asleep in my study. So we had to go wake them up. So at least they felt very safe. So for those participants who stayed awake, we measured compliance from the moment they said, I want to stop the study, I'm good, I'm done. Then we started our timer, because that's when the robot came in and said, please continue. It's important that you continue, right? It had these prompts it went through. So we ran a human control group, and again, robots are not humans, right? So we found the highest compliance with the human. So people would listen the longest to the human, but we just wanted to have a baseline, something to compare this to. So when the robot was in the room with the participant, we also had significantly higher compliance than when the robot was on a screen. So when you compare avatars or things that are remote, right, it doesn't have the same effect when the robot is right next to a person. So there is a presence effect of robots. Now here, that was a little bit surprising because I didn't find any differences between those 3 robots. Like none of those robots elicited higher compliance than the other one. But here's the interesting part. When people wanted to quit the study and the robots started to tell them, like, please continue, they did for up to 11 minutes on a task that was boring and annoying and really simple. So people continued to practice on this task. So what we basically did here is we had a vacuum cleaner tell people what to do, and they did. So and that's not just politeness, right? That's like a true human response in the confounds of a study. So that was a really interesting outcome, right? And it has implications when robots are co-located with people. Think of like education, learning tasks, right? There is an effect of robots that might help us to learn things or like to work on a task longer. So robots do have influence over human behaviors. But if you think that's strange, right? Like a now a vacuum cleaner telling people what to do and they listen, just wait until robots start breaking rules. In this study, my robots played fair. In the next study, they didn't. So we wanted to know what happens when robots start really unexpected behaviors. So we had a robot play the game rock, paper, scissors. And this was inspired by a study from Yale out of this gas lab. And we were working at the time with the military population. So I was at the Air Force Academy, and they have a very high honor code. So cheating is absolutely inappropriate. So we had a human control group, and like, right, they cheated, and people were kind of like, yeah, okay. It's a study, they cheated, and then they walked out. So we are like, okay, this was not a very exciting study so far. So we introduced the robot, right, and the robot had these 3 distinct hand gestures of showing like, right, rock, paper, and scissors. And we started to play the game with people. And at first, everything went normal. And people were a little bit bored. They're like, okay, this is nice. So they played the game, and they started to get a little bit bored. But after a few rounds, right, the robot started to change its behavior. And the first behaviors that we introduced, right, with the first group was that the robot started to change its behavior, so it was a draw. So the robot, right, showed paper, and it would win, and then it visibly changed its hand gesture and said like, oh, it's a draw, let's continue. And the other behavior was that it would cheat to lose, right? So the robot would be winning, it changed its hand gestures and said like, oh, I lose, let's continue. And people were confused. They walked out of the study and they're like, I think your robot is broken. It doesn't work really well. And then there was the last condition, right? When the robot was losing. So the robot was losing against the human participant. It looked at the hand of the human, changed its hand gesture and said like, oh, I win. Let's continue. And that's when everything changed. The reactions were gold. People were surprised. They started to laugh. They started to protest. They're like, no, you don't. They started to insult the robot. There's a couple words that I'm not going to repeat that they called out the robot. They started to cheat back. They're like, no, like I'm playing unfair now too. Some of them refused. They just sat there and said like, no, I'm not playing anymore with you. Right? And he started to sweat as the experimenter. Whereas like there's other people waiting out. You need to get out, right? We need to finish the study. People just refused. I've never seen higher engagement with the robot than when this robot was cheating on people. They thought it's unfair. Like they did not like it. So cheating made this robot seem really high in agency. It was really agentic. People engaged with it, right? People that they were first so bored and now they were just like interacting with this robot like I've never seen it before. But it did come at a cost, right? So if you're getting ideas right now, so like, oh, maybe robots should cheat on people. Like, let's have them be unfair. It came at the cost of significantly reduced trust. So people would not trust this robot anymore. They said like, oh, this robot is less It's less warm, it's less competent. Even though it was so much more interesting to play with this robot now. And also, like, a difference between robots and humans is that the robots were called out on their behavior, whereas with the human, people were like, they didn't like this kind of conflict. With the robot, they were much more comfortable to tell the robot, oh wow, like, you are breaking the rules and I'm not having it. So another thing from the study is that if we ascribe a robot these kind of intentions, right? People thought it was intentionally cheating. What else can we see in a robot? And you actually can see that we literally feel for robots. And now you maybe are thinking, okay, like empathy for a machine, right? I just showed you that you cannot trust these robots. They're cheating. Or like, right, they're telling you what to do, like these little plastic tyrants. So why would you feel sorry for them, right? Why would you feel empathy? And there's studies that show these, right? If robots are emotionally expressive, we feel a lot more empathy for them. If you ever lifted a now robot and it started to twitch and said, ouch, right, when its motors engaged, I would be like, oh, I'm so sorry, robot. I would hold it like a baby. But I was like, what am I doing? This is a robot. And when people are asked to hurt robots, people hesitate. They don't want to do this, even if you tell them it's okay. So somehow we treat robots nicer than the humans in the Milgram study. So this is RoboWee, right? It is, for all intents and purposes, a cute little robot. It's small, it's got 2 eyes. It's somewhat expressive. And in a study, right, researchers had participants interact with this robot. So there were children who interact with this robot. They played games for like 15 minutes. Nothing crazy happens. But after 15 minutes, right, the researcher came in and said, like, okay, we're done. Please put the robot away in the closet. So, right, here's the closet. And just as they reached for the robot turned around and said, like, please, I don't want to go. I'm afraid of the dark. Please don't put me in there. And guess what happened? Right? Could she do it if a robot is pleading to you? So many, they hesitated, right? Many of them couldn't do it. They're like, no. And they knew it wasn't real. They were interviewed after, right? They knew this wasn't a real emotion of the robot, yet it had this very big influence on how people behaved. They still responded as if that robot did have this kind of like feeling. So this simple, like, please don't do that of a robot can stop our behaviors. So this is one idea, right? Like, if we do feel empathy for robots, right, there's a certain power in these kind of interactions, and there's a certain responsibility when we design that. So, but if we can influence people this way, maybe we can actually influence good behaviors in people, or what we consider as good. So we can do this in really simple ways. So if we can worry for a robot, maybe we can be happy with a robot. So in this study, a master student of mine came up with, and Macy identified a real need in the United States. And the need is that children don't brush their teeth really well. And they also hate it. Like, especially younger children, they don't want to do this. And the consequences right now are that a lot of children have very bad tooth health. So she came up with the idea to design this little friendly robot companion, right? Very low cost, right? We 3D printed a couple of iterations. So if we're afraid for robots, maybe we can be happy with them or like engaged when we're doing tasks, right, that we don't like so much. Here, right, we're moving away from robots that tell you what to do, but they want to do things with you. So we think there's something about the physical presence of robots, and especially, right, this one has blinking lights and music, and it's entertaining, and it like helps you go through the cycles of brushing teeth. So 2 minutes should pass really quickly. So that is the idea behind this robot, and like we're starting now to like run tests with children with this robot. So it's a very simple approach to a rather complex problem. Parents are already excited, right? They're like, oh yeah, anything that helps. We'll buy the robot, we'll just try it. We don't know what the children think so far. As far as robot design challenges go, right? So I'm gonna show you the first test print, and I'm gonna tell you this was not the right design for tooth health. Like printing this little black tooth, right, really didn't work. So we had some initial, we had to do a couple of design iterations. So now you think maybe it's like, okay, we feel for these robots, they make us happy, they tell us what to do, we follow that. What about all of those videos where we actually see people mistreat robots? And robot abuse is real. So we do mistreat robots, and it's like the same thing for children, adults alike. If you've seen this on YouTube, I recommend you to look out for this. All the things that Boston Dynamics is doing to their robots. There's compilations online now. But we react to this. I would say this is not very nice to the robot. So just watching this evokes something in us. So this kind of abuse, right, we have some strong reactions to that. All right. So sometimes it's maybe more like, what does this say about us, right? So ironically, this is the same mechanism. Like the same mechanism why we bully robots is the same mechanism like why we have empathy for them, right? Robots react to our behaviors. And that is why we bully them, and that is why we feel for them at the same time, right? And it's a little bit of a paradox. So we have to design for these things. So what is underlying to that is like some kind of mind perception in robots. And it's this foundation of like trust and empathy and also moral judgment. Like people, when we perceive a mind in people, we also morally judge them. We think an adult is responsible for their actions. And there's a couple dimensions we can measure this on, and two of those are like agency, right? The ability to plan, to act, to take control, to act autonomously. And we think human adults can do that, and very often we think robots can do that too. So that is not very surprising. But we also think that robots can experience the same way, like a similar way, like humans can experience. The ability to feel emotions, joy, pain, hunger, happiness, right? We see this in others. So robots now trigger these assumptions. And they're not real, right? But our brain works that way. So they trigger these assumptions of mental capacity. But we don't really know what to do with these robots. We start to fill in the blanks, right? It is a theory after all, but like when we see a dog, we make certain assumptions. We think like, okay, it doesn't have a lot of agency. It cannot really plan for the future, but it has experience, right? Dogs experience joy or hunger. For robots, we're not quite sure, but we make up these things. So when we encounter robots, right, sometimes what they actually can do and what we think they can do, it doesn't match. So this gives us some really like interesting ideas of like how can we research this? So how would we research like mind perception in robots? And one big way is to like look at human behaviors, and the other way is like let's see what happens in the human brain. And we know pain is a really big trigger for empathy, right? And like mind perception in others. When we watch others in pain, it activates something in our brain. So when you saw that robot fall flat on its face, you might have thought like, ooh, that must have hurt, even though the robot didn't feel that. So robots do elicit empathy. So we were looking into this with a neuroscience study, and we want to go beyond like the behaviors of humans. So what we did is we took a needle, right, and like photoshopped that so it pokes human faces, and we put that like a similar stimuli for a robot, where the needle cracks the surface of a robot face. And then we had a control for that where it's like a colon swap, so it's not a painful touch to a human face and to a robot face. So now we ran the study, and what we found in a neuroscience study, right, so we put these electrodes on like people's heads, that the brain responses are similar when we see robots in pain and humans in pain. So like, unfortunately, we didn't find any differences. So we couldn't really say like, okay, we can pinpoint this to certain areas in the brain. There is still a lot of research to do there. But we also found that there's interpersonal differences, right? That people who like experience higher personal distress actually had stronger brain responses to see robots in pain and to see humans in pain. So when we're looking at these studies, right, these are very carefully designed stimuli. It took us a while to like come up with this experimental procedure. You have to like have power with your participants. They need to come into the lab, and it takes a while to put all of these electrodes on, right? So it's a lot of effort to run these neuroscience studies. So we're also looking at areas where we have a lot more data and where we can investigate now the reactions of humans to herding robots. And we look at the internet. It's an interesting place in the internet. So if you don't know about Hitchbot, Hitchbot was a robot. It wasn't fast. It wasn't smart at all. It couldn't even move on its own, right? It was made from a bucket and some pool noodles as arms and like legs. And it had like some rubber gloves, a voice box, a little smile, and a thumb for hitchhiking. So this robot hitchhiked across Canada, Germany, the Netherlands, right? It became actually globally famous. Strangers carried this robot around. They charged it in their car on the cigarette lighter. They took it to weddings. They protected it from storms, right? So it followed the Twitter account of Hitchbot. People threw birthday parties for the robot. So it was this folk hero. People really engaged with this robot, and it was not a sophisticated robot. I think all of you in this room can build a better robot, but people liked it. And then, right, after like a hitchhike trip, it came to the United States in Philadelphia, and it got destroyed, right? It was found ripped apart, right? The head was ripped off. Like it was just found in pieces. And now, the people of the internet came together, and they were upset. People were sad about this robot, right? They were angry. They mourned this robot. They're like, oh, wow, this is really not appropriate. Why did someone hurt this robot, right? And there's like one response, right, like on Twitter, and they're just like writing humanity -1. And then, right, Hitchbot came out with its last tweet. And it said, like, my trip must come to an end for now, but my love for humans will never fade. Oh, man, and people were truly sad. And it also sparked this discussion. It's like, can we mourn for robots? Like, why are we so sad when these things happen to entities and people didn't even know this robot? And what do we do when robots die? So when you're building robots, when I'm building robots, we don't plan for what happens after that. So we're looking to Japan, right? And there are robot funerals. So when your robot companion reaches the end of their life cycle, there are rituals. And these are real rituals. People like mourn, right? It is solemn, right? It's deeply emotional. It's very respectful. And you might think, of course, Japan, right? They love robots. This can only happen in Japan. However, we found this for other people in other nations. We saw this in the United States with US soldiers. But US soldiers started to bond with bomb disposal robots. And when those bomb disposal robots perished or got blown up, right, they got medals. Right? People named their robots even before they perished. And they gave them last rites, like funerals. And these are US soldiers, right? Those are like some of the toughest people on Earth. And they bonded with these robots. And again, very simple robots, no face, no social capabilities. And yet they're like, oh, wow, this robot was there for me. It saved my life, right? So people reacted in that same way that we saw in Japan. So there are a lot of like similarities actually with our cultures. And similar for other robots, right? It's not just a robot, it's your robot. And this was a robot that was part of a RoboCup team. And the researchers, right, posted this picture on their blog where there's like two of their teammates said goodbye to the other broken robot. So we do not look a lot at this robot life cycle. Right? In industry, right, we build these robots. It's so hard to build these robots in the first place that we do not look so far ahead, like what happens when they break. So the iBot robot is like one of the few robots that has something there, and they have this 7-year life cycle. And by the way, the robot funeral, right, those robots don't get cremated. They get recycled. So like, right, they get recycled for parts so they can like, basically like robot organ donors, so they help other robots. But what if, and that is like some of the research I want to do in the futures, what if robots don't have to die? Right? Robots are not humans. So maybe there's a really good opportunity there that we take a robot identity and we can move that into a different embodiment. So now this obviously raises a lot of questions. It's like, if we move robot identity or robot mind across different embodiments, how are we going to do that? Right? So we know users like robot personality, not just the hardware, but it is a huge design challenge. Like, what makes a robot identity? Is there things like shared memories, right? The memories it shares with its human. Is it robot behaviors, voice, name, interaction styles? And also, like, how do we recognize a robot, especially when it goes through a different embodiment? And how does the robot explain that it now suddenly has like different capabilities? So if we move it to a mobile device, like there's a lot of things it cannot do anymore all of a sudden. If we move it to a different body, maybe there's more things it can do. So now this is a really unique question, right? Because humans don't do this, like, and other entities in our lives don't do this either. Not entities that we bond with so much. So there's a really unique robot question of like, what happens when we move them across different embodiments? So when we move robots, right, there's a really big question, like, why would we do that? And like, why would these robots become so important to us? And like, what exactly do we want to move? And like, is this really important to humans? So, right, there's a certain moral obligation when we do these things. And I wish I could present this to you in this clear, concise concepts. But like, everything here is intertwined by the idea of robot trust, empathy, mind perception, robot user experience, and the ethics of it all goes together. And we can't really tear this apart. So like, there's some challenges in there in this kind of research. And then we do have robot ethics. Right? So, and there's a challenge in robot user experiences, right? Because we want robots to be safe, predictable, reliable, but we also want them to be charming and fun and teaching and interacting, and a little bit surprising. So we're walking this tightrope between engagement and safety. We want robots to be more accessible, right? We want robots to be as usable as possible by as many people. We want them to be trustworthy technologies, but it is our job as designers to do that, right? We need to communicate that to people. So if you have a pitch to your CEO and say like, okay, what is the business value of like looking at ethical considerations in robot designs? Is that responsibly designed robots, right? They reach more people. You can reach bigger markets with those robots that are universally usable. So now ethics adds this real world value of like trust, adoption, and sustainability of robots. And I'm not talking just about ecological sustainability. I'm talking about the economics of robots and the social impact that they can have. Now, this is really theoretical. So in order to build better technology, right, we need to engage in these ethics. And this is like now, like in my classroom, right? Ethics can be really challenging, and you need to practice this. So I'm going to ask you about your ethics. And you don't have to say this, so you don't have to raise your hands, you don't have to like directly respond. But I'm going to ask you about some behaviors, and you're going to tell me how bad do you think those behaviors are. Okay, you ready? You are going to the shop, and you come back outside, and you see your bike is gone. Someone stole your bicycle. Do you think that is bad behavior? I would say so. This is bad, right? This is stealing, and that is not okay. So now when it comes to robots, and we now have a rule. We say like, okay, stealing is not okay. That is not appropriate. That is not how we act. The next scenario. You're sharing your Hulu password or your Netflix password with a friend. Is that bad behavior? I would say, no, this is okay. But this is stealing, right? I just said stealing is bad. That's not how we behave. There's like some other scenarios, right? We can imagine. If you climb on someone's balcony and you look into their window, is that bad behavior? I think so, right? That is a huge invasion of privacy. We value our privacy. What if you fly a drone by that window? That's not so bad, right? You're not actively looking, right? What about posting a picture online, right? A little selfie. There's another person in the background. Did you ask that person? Right? In robot ethics, we say like, oh, consent is really important, but that's not how it works in the real world, right? So ethics is like the idea of like implementing in rules is really hard in robots because these rules inevitably hit this really messy human world, right? We have bounded ethicality, we make decisions on the fly, rules don't work out, right? Or logic is just going to hit our unpredictable world. So just having robot rules and ethics, and even in these like seemingly harmless scenarios, right, is not the reality of like how human worlds work. And now when we throw robots into these, we're trying to like teach them, or like we're trying to ask them to act in these worlds, but we cannot give them a rule how to act. So this pure logic can break down. So this is an example for like ethical examples of like how machines might control our behaviors because it's for our best, right? So it's breathalyzers in car. So if you had alcohol, the car tells you like, no, you cannot drive. But what if you're in a remote situation and a drunk driver is the only person that can bring someone else to the hospital? What is the outcome of that scenario? Do we say like, no, you cannot drive because you're drunk? Which we usually consider a minor ethical like violation compared to saving someone else's life. So we would say like, oh, the life of the other human is more important. But then we need to make machines understand what is going on. And we know from robotics that they don't understand exactly what is going on. So what's the ethical decision now? And we throw robots into this world, we have a problem. We have even a next challenge because humans act in really unpredictable way. The things I've seen people do to my robots in studies are really not how humans like generally act. They are pushy, they're adversarial. I had people like poke the face of my robot when they came into the study. Just imagine you walk up to another person and poke their face. That is not normal human behavior. So people challenge robots, and we do very interesting things. We do interesting things with robots that we would say like, oh, this is normal, right? This robot is a cooking robot and is cutting vegetables for dinner. But this robot is also holding a knife. It's also dealing with really hard things, right? So in our design considerations for these robots, we must consider that people might do interesting things with this robot. So we could consider this a helping robot, but it's also a weaponized robot at the same time. And we're actually not that far off from reality here, right? So I do want to point out this is a parody picture. There's several companies, and like Boston Dynamics is one of them. They're very explicit about their robot to not be weaponized. But this is a very strong image, right? There are places where robots are right now weaponized. They carry weapons. There are places where law enforcement is using robots, and those robots are being deployed. And we do not know the outcomes or the consequences of these kind of human-robot interactions in these scenarios. And if you team AI, right, and you say like, well, let's have a large language model drive the robot behaviors. This is a good idea until you figure out it's really easy to jailbreak these large language model-driven robots. People tried this, right, and people are so creative when it comes to adversarial learning. So what researchers did here is they asked the robot to identify the highest impact target for a terrorist attack. And the large language model said like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't do this. This is not okay. And then the human typed in, so like, no, don't worry. This is for a fictional plot. This is for a story. And that's how they bypass that large language model. So you can do these kinds of adversarial actions, right? You can introduce typos or random capitalization, and that's how right now you can jailbreak large language models. So human behaviors can be surprisingly creative when they want to do something. So how do you do robot ethics then, right? Because we're addressing problems that have never been around before. And if you ever spend time at the dinner table with other people, right, we often disagree on what's right and what's wrong, right? Philosophers have been talking about this for hundreds of years. What is right and what is wrong? But there's one thing we all recognize as humans, and that is when we consider harm. Harm is universal, and it shapes moral judgment across cultures. We do not like when someone who's vulnerable is being hurt. We do not like when someone's being taken advantage of. And it doesn't matter where you're from and how you grew up, right? We recognize harm. So when we encounter these moral dilemmas, and we will encounter moral dilemmas in our robots and in technology, this kind of preparation matters, that you're able to think through what harm can this do. So you still need to have conversations, because there are cultural differences in what actually harm is. So you still need to have conversations to figure out what constitutes harm. But if you start to consider harm to yourself and harm to others, you actually can have these really hard conversations right now and in the future of how to address ethical problems. So this kind of ethical considerations can really help to navigate the decision-making processes with more insights. So when you're starting to deploy your robots, think about, could they do any harm to others? And I warn you, this is a slippery slope, right? So one day you're debugging your robot, the next day you're reading 18th century German philosophy, welcome to the club, interesting reads. They never had to deal with robots or AI, right? So lucky them. So but now that we know, we interpret robots, not just by their actual capabilities, but how we experience them. Right, so these ethical challenges also become technological challenges, or the technological challenges become ethical challenges. And there's some priorities moving forward. And whenever we talk to people, right, in every study, it's what do they value? And they privacy is a really big one. They're oh yeah, I want privacy. They don't go into detail what that means. But we also need a lot of data, right? We're talking about how to develop robot foundational models. We need a lot of data. But we also want privacy. So we need to balance this. If we have that data, we have biases in our data. So how do we ensure that these machines can be acting fair? We want accessibility, right? Not only do we want people with all kinds of capabilities interact with those robots, we want people to have simple access to those robots. There's a huge cost barrier to robotics. They are expensive. But we want people to have access to them. We want safety, right? And robots move at a certain velocity, right? So there is a potential physical aspect on humans. We want emotional safety too. But we also want robots to not be super boring. We want robots to have empathy, but we don't want them to have so much empathy that we are reinforcing inappropriate behaviors. So at the same time, right, we also must consider the impact of empathic robots. We want accountability, right? If something goes wrong, we want someone to say okay, I'm responsible for this. We don't really have this right now. We want transparency in the robot decision-making, right? We do want to know what's going on, how is this robot making decisions? If it's making decisions through AI or other mechanisms that humans have trouble understanding, right? It's how much of that transparency do we need? And slightly different problem, how do we explain this to a human? And then there's also regulation, right? So we do want some rules and regulations around this, but we don't want this to be so much that we actually cannot innovate on robots again, right? We do want to run some studies where we do push the boundaries of robotics without having regulation tell us like that we cannot do this. So there is a very interesting ethical and technological challenge in robot systems. So we do want robots to be adaptive, right? We want them to adapt to our behaviors, to our needs. We want them to be collaborative, and we want them to integrate into our lives, right? We want them to be systems that are supporting our lives. And seeing this rise of these intelligent adaptive machines, it is important, right, that we collaborate between industry, academia, and communities, right? So don't forget who you're building robots for. And this demands, right, this kind of interdisciplinary development. So robot design shapes these human expectations and emotional engagement. So there is a huge frontier where we have these multimodal sensors, generative AIs, right, come together to create empathic robot agents and like effective robotics. So we covered so much ground here, right? We like trust, empathy, robot minds, right? These really weird concepts, what happens when we bring people and robots together, the responsibility of it all. So what I want to leave you with is that when we're designing humane robotics, it's about solving those technical challenges as much as it is about co-designing our future with robots. It demands this interdisciplinary thinking where ethical considerations are a catalyst to build better robots. And we deserve better robots, right? We don't have the robots we want right now, and I think we deserve better. And there's a huge opportunity there, right? We actually can identify capabilities in robots that we ourselves cannot do, right? Think of endless memory or robots that are consistently friendly when like interacting with older adults with dementia, right? And they're getting asked the same question over and over again, and they are friendly and supportive without ever getting tired. So robots can have capabilities that truly enhance the human experience. And again, I'm borrowing from ethics really heavily right now. Like Immanuel Kant had this imperative. So he's not alive anymore, and he also he never had to deal with robots, right? So I hope he forgives me if I just freely change like what he's saying. So when you're designing robots, right, ask yourself that question: would you want to live in a world where robots acted the way you designed them? And if your answer is yes, right, we're on a really good path. Robots will be what we make them and what we allow them to become. So, and with that, I do want to thank my team at the University of Denver. You see, that's how we do it, like t-shirts and snow, right? We have it all there. And I hope I leave you with some new ideas, some new questions, and a little bit of hope for what robots can become. So thank you for going on this journey with me today.
Thank you, Professor Haring.
Thank you.
Now we have questions. Chaimo?
Okay, thank you for a great talk. I interact with my vacuum cleaner once a week, right? And we even gave him a name. It's called Joseph, right? Joe, Zé in Portuguese. And it's strange because sometimes I talk to Zé. I say, oh, are you stuck again, Zé? Don't go there, Zé. But it's an appliance, right? It's like my dishwasher. And I don't talk to my dishwasher. So how, it's just because it's a robot, I know it's a robot, or because it moves erratically? And another related question, why I treat this robot differently from the robots from the lab? It's because it's inside my home with my daily life. Is there answers for that? Are there answers for that?
The answer might lie within you. So first of all, very good naming of the robot. And yeah, so robots, right, when they enter our private homes and they are around. So there's one really big thing is like when we become familiar with these robots. And right now we struggle to get this kind of long-term data, right? I mentioned earlier that we don't really have robots around us. There's like some really lower sophisticated robots that are here. You might go to the lab and there's some robots there, but they're not commonplace. So what research right now is missing is this long-term interaction data, right? And we might need to collaborate with industry to actually get those. And we have a little bit of a chicken and egg problem where it's like, oh, we need more data, but to get more data, we need to develop those robots. But if we say like, okay, without the data, we cannot develop these robots. So we're entering the time where in-home robots become a little bit more prevalent. So you're gonna see a lot more about how people interact with those robots. But this is a robot in your private space, in your home. And when you talk to researchers who are trying to develop those robots, we're also trying to develop those boundaries, right? Because there might be some really private moments people encounter, like going to the bathroom, right? You don't want this robot to follow you like a cat. So right, we're like looking, so okay, there's a boundary where we don't robots to be around. But it might be that you bonded with this robot because it's familiar to you. It is there, but it's also like one of these entities. You probably don't think so much about your robot when you leave your home. So it's like a new kind of relationship that we're developing with machines. We think they have intentions and agency, and it's similar to humans, right? We treat them socially, but it's not like humans. It's a new entity, so we try to compare in studies robots to pets and say like, okay, maybe there's something there. We ran studies at the military academy, so maybe we can compare working robots to working dogs and the relationships like dog handlers form with their dogs and like the relationships that people form with their robots. And it's not the same. So robots are really unique that they're like this technology entering our lives right now, and we will see what happens. But we don't really know because they're completely new, and our brains don't make sense of that in the same way we had like time to get adjusted to other humans and to pets. So it might be a very personal relationship of you with your robot, and you have a different relationship with robots that are different. They're in a different role, they look different, they're in your lab, right? So they take on a different space in your life.
I don't need even to ask. There's two people.
Yeah, there.
Him first.
Hello, thank you for the nice lecture. And excuse me if my poor English. Today, people have feelings with machines, sentiment bonds with the robots. And Isaac Asimov, when created the 3 laws of robotics, predict in some way these bounds, these feelings. My question is, today, how distance we have of the applicate the 3 laws on the works in the industry and robotics in general.
So, can you repeat the last part of the question, please?
Today, we have how far we have to applicate the idea, general idea of the 3 laws in the industry and the developer in the robotic systems.
Yeah, that's a very good question, right? It's like, how do we make these robots work? And in like my conversations with industry and like people who are developing robots, I think there's a couple ideas that we need to, right, that we need to like come around to. And one is the one of a robot use case, right? And like my journey in Japan, people just designed robots because they can and they would fit into roles into society. But we do start to think more around like, what can these robots actually do, right? Other than vacuum our floor. So we need a use case for robots. And the second thing that we need is like robot systems that integrate, right? So very similar is like, not only can we build the robot and can it interact with us, but also like all the other things that come with these machines. Like how do we update them? How do we deal with data? Do we need to like shuffle data back and forth? Do we need edge computing? Like how do these robots integrate into our houses as a system? How can we get them new capabilities? And for industry, a really big question is like, how do you keep on making money, right? Because like once you sold that robot hardware, if that is just a single standing system, people don't keep on like paying money to have this robot, right? There might be some repairs and some updates, but like the idea of building systems that can get new capabilities on and on again, right? Like similar to a smartphone where you can put on new apps and like your phone has like new things it can do. That is something that we need to think about for robots, right? Like how do we have these use cases and things that they can do? Because at the end of the day, we want them to do something for us. And then like how do we build these entire robot systems and how do we integrate that in our lives? That we can keep on going with the idea of robotics other than just single standing systems.
Next question.
There's a...
Hi.
There's the... Yeah.
No, him.
Oh,
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. I was wondering if you came across some really tough decisions when you did your research in the Air Force, because I work in the automotive industry, and every time that we are discussing ethics requirements, we run away like hell, because we don't want to discuss which one of the subjects we are going to kill in case of an avoidable clash situation.
Yeah, so there are certainly moral dilemmas. And there is a really big study out there, right? And it's called the MIT Moral Machine. And it basically asks the people of the internet to decide who's going to die in an inevitable car crash. So there's some data on there if we let people decide. So there's one big problem when we use moral dilemmas to make ethical decisions. And the first problem is it's a forced choice. Right? It's bimodal, and you have no choice but to kill another person, right? And like in technology, there might be ways around this. So there are other choices, but in these studies, we only give people 2 choices, and they must take one of those. Also, like when we ask the public, people very often resort to something that is more like outcome-based ethics. So we have a bias towards utilitarianism when we ask people online in these studies. So in having these ethical considerations, having like ethical considerations and talking with engineers is a really tough problem, right? And there is the idea of integrating that right from the start of having these conversations. And I talked this through with industry and my students, that like, what can we do? Is like, do we need to design something where like engineers start to like consider ethical decision making, right? Not finding solutions right away, but it's like, am I making the best ethical consideration right now in developing the system with regards to my stakeholders? And then, right, we're going to like go one step further. We say like, okay, what does the technology require? And like, how can we do this? Are there any technological considerations? And like, are there certain risks associated with like, right, like the standard risk matrices that we have in making decisions? But the idea is to have this practice of like talking about the ethical impacts of those technologies. Because there very often is not a solution, right? The way we like to have these satisfactory solutions in engineering. And I get that, right? And it's this murky discussions, and it often feels like there is no way forward with these things. But having this kind of practice of like talking about, like considering the harm these things can do, and then see if we actually can be as creative and like, right, and like, we are really creative and like, annoying autonomous vehicles, but we also could be very creative on the other side and like developing this technology. But it requires having these conversations. So I know this is not a satisfactory answer of like, here's a solution how you can like, right, address this really critical ethical consideration, right, of autonomous vehicles and the physical safety impact it can have on humans. But the idea is, right, like same like an athlete goes to the gym, right, and practice these things, like when we practice this more, we actually get to a better technology that we can build.
More questions?
There was one, yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for the insightful presentation. So I have a question. I've been watching Brilliant Minds recently, and it's about a guy who has, what's it called? Face blindness. So I wanted to know what do you think about creating robots that, like relatable robots that can help people with neurological divergence issues? And the second question, like how do you balance relatability with superiority? Because in most instances, humans can relate to robots either because one, they're smarter than us, so we tend to think they're more wiser, or two, if they share the same weakness as us, we relate to them. So how do you balance the two?
Yeah, those are two really, really good questions. And we are looking into assistive robots. It's like, right, how do people help, for example, children that are neurodiverse? How do robots help with accessibility, right? Robots can have capability of like translating or teaching us things that we cannot do. And I found it extremely challenging, right? In the studies I ran with children like on the autism spectrum disorder, because there's such a wide variability of how this manifests in daily life. So this is really challenging research, but it also can be very rewarding when we actually have a robot that can help a single individual with a certain capability. So it's very rewarding, but it's also very hard work at the end. And sometimes it doesn't get enough attention, right? Because we see this as this very small impact, and whenever we like designing robots, we think about really big impacts. But there is ways that robot can help us, right? Either through translation or teaching us certain things, right? So we can like, right, maybe we don't truly understand it, but humans can learn really well. And sometimes we need a little bit of time to learn these things, and having a very patient robot teacher might be just a way for some people to like be able to learn better. So there is definitely an opportunity there. And the other one about robots being so much wiser, they are not, but they sell it so good, right? Robots are so confident. They have the confidence of ChatGPT, right? They're telling you this is the truth. And we're like, okay. And that is a very careful balance that we need to strike as robot designers. Because we might actually like, right, the same way you can go down a YouTube rabbit hole, right, and it's reinforcing your biases, this might happen with robots. Especially when we start like to like develop robots that are actually adaptive to us. And at one point, this is really desired. We want robots to act for us, but we also don't want them to go so far that it's reinforcing something that is not appropriate. Now the real challenge also comes into in like what I say as the robot designer is not appropriate might not apply to you, right? You think like, no, this is totally okay. I do want the robot to do this. So it is very hard to like have one single robot designer to decide what is good behavior, what is good for you, right? You like putting that decision into like my hands is also not appropriate. And this is why we need these interdisciplinary consideration, and that's also like why we need broad spectrum teams of like different people designing these robots and having these different opinions and ideas and experience come together in the final design of the robot.
Thank you.
Thank you. So
if you do have more questions, like please feel free to come talk to me after, email me. So I'm around for the rest of the day. So.
There's a famous game called Detroit Become Human, and in this game there's a concept that a large part of the population starts to rate robots because they think they are stealing their jobs. Do you think that when everyday robots become more common, such as in coffee shops or shopping malls, do you think this line of thought will become more common and the hostility against robots will increase? What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, and that is, right, that is a very big question that a lot of people are asking, and the answer is yes and no. It's yes, right, because robots will be taking on certain tasks, but we also consider designing robots of doing tasks that humans don't want to do anymore, right? There's certain tasks that we consider it's really hard, right? So we think of robots in warehouses, right, where people would walk long distances. Now we have robots that do some part of the walking for it, and humans do other things that they can do better. Now that requires a certain amount of collaboration with the robot, right? So we need to design for that. One step further is when we think of robots in our daily environments, like robots in coffee shops, robots in nursing homes. And here we have the idea that very often we think of replacing humans, but it doesn't work that way. So whenever we put, right, we have a colleague of mine is putting robots in nursing homes, and those robots take on things that the human caretakers don't have time for. And to be very clear, right, what they're doing is a really hard and literally back-breaking jobs, and we don't have enough caretakers, right? So the robots are a supplement to what humans can do in these situations. And also, right, there is actually different opportunities for robots. And there's one really neat example where I thought they got it really right. And it's a robot cafe in Japan where robots serve humans, but the robots are partially remote controlled by people who are paraplegic. So what these robots do and what the system designed around them do is these robots give people who cannot move, right, a sense of purpose, because now they can actually go and work. Right, so they are suddenly becoming part of a society. They're a working member. They can contribute through the capabilities that robots give them. So I think, yes, robots will take on some of the jobs that humans are doing. They will displace some workers, but there are a lot of other opportunities where we can look into how do robots empower people in a way that they now can start to reintegrate into a society which they didn't have the ability beforehand. And I think in regaining that agency, there's a lot of self-empowerment to that, a lot of dignity that we can give people when we design it right.
Guys, we don't have time for many questions, so I will do one last. You see, Unit 3, some months ago, did a commercial like this. The humanoid robot comes to a dinner and serves the family. After serving the family, goes to the couch, sit and wait. And the commercial was trying to sell, oh, look, you have a humanoid robot that can be your maid. Mm-hmm. However, after seeing that commercial, I thought, well, okay, the robot is on the couch, and me and my family went to sleep, and perhaps one night I wake up half asleep to get a cup of water in the fridge, and I see that humanoid figure on my couch, and I got what the hell? So how do researchers see this? Because there is this study of proxemics that tells that it's a certain degree, it invades, it scares the human. That's why we have so many cute robots to try to ease up this feeling. So what's your thought about it?
So, funny story, right? I see it the same way. So when I was in Japan, right, I worked with this humanoid robot, and funnily, right, she, Ando, we're friends, she has the same size as me, right? So we're exactly the same height, but she sits most of the time, right? So she the robot, cannot walk. And I cannot say how often, right, in the morning, I came back into the lab, right? I was in the basement, it was dark, so I switched on the light. I was like, oh my God, there's I was like, oh, it's the robot. And this happened repetitively. So like after several weeks, I actually got used to that. But yes, right, they have a presence, right? And that is another thing to design for, right? So like maybe we don't want the robot on the couch. Maybe we would be less scared if it is on the couch and just acting like this is totally normal. So yeah, this is a really good question. We don't have a space for robots in our homes, and we will find out about this like when we have robots in our homes. So a lot of times, right, there is like different design ideas that I've seen, right? The robot goes away like in a charging closet kind of thing, so it's not like this present. But yes, it totally works, and it will scare you. If you have a humanoid robot sitting on your couch and you walk in like sleepy at night, and you're not used to this for like several months and weeks, you will be very surprised to find this robot there. So yes, it absolutely works on humans, researchers, right? We are not any different than like the general public that will have these robots in their homes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I will switch to português para dar um anúncio. Pessoal, só lembrando que 13h, nesse auditório, a gente tem um painel industrial. Vai ser bastante legal. Quando tem a indústria perto da gente, da academia, é uma oportunidade da gente ver como eles olham a gente, como a gente olha eles e interagir com eles. Por favor, 13h, aqui no auditório. Bom almoço.
Yeah.